In the last videos, we discussed the motivations behind the outbreak of the First and Second World Wars. Today, we will delve into a topic that could have led to the Third World War, potentially even deadlier than the previous two. We're talking, of course, about the Cold War. Contrary to what the name suggests, the Cold War wasn't a direct military conflict between superpowers, but rather a political and ideological struggle between two socio-economic blocs that spanned 44 years, from 1947 to 1991. This conflict revolved around competing ideologies and zones of influence.
Most of the city appears to have been obliterated. 4 square miles of desolation are reported.
It's impossible to separate the Cold War from the context of the Second World War, as these two nations emerged as the world's most powerful due to their pivotal roles during the war. Their military strength and preparation, combined with the fact that both entered the conflict in 1941, 2 years after it began, allowed them to maintain rested forces and escape extensive attacks on their territories. As a result, the United States and the Soviet Union became the primary nations responsible for ending the war alongside Great Britain. Meanwhile, other global powers of the time, like France, Germany, and Britain itself, suffered more directly from the socio-economic destruction caused by the Second World War. This solidified the global leadership and dominance of the Americans and Soviets. Historians agree that the Cold War officially began in 1947 when U.S. President Harry Truman delivered an anti-communist speech aimed at curbing the Red expansion in Europe. This led to the Marshall Plan, which funded the reconstruction of European countries devastated by the Second World War to gain their support and align them with the United States and capitalist ideals. In response, the Soviet Union initiated its fourth five-year plan to rebuild the nations within its territory. Gradually, the Soviet Union strengthened ties and expanded zones of influence across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, aiming to bolster the socialist bloc on a global scale. While there was never a formal declaration of war between the United States and the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War, numerous regional conflicts and wars were politically and militarily supported by the two superpowers. The division of Germany into zones of influence by both blocs in the 1940s was one of the most significant movements in this regard. Germany was fragmented into capitalist-controlled zones, led by the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, and a socialist-controlled zone under the Soviet Union. This resulted in the formation of West Germany, capitalist, and East Germany, socialist. In 1949, later culminating in the construction of the Berlin Wall, which divided the city from 1961 until its fall in 1989. Military conflicts like the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, where the U.S. supported South Korea while the Soviets backed North Korea, illustrate this dynamic. Other conflicts, such as the Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989, the Vietnam War, 1959 to 1975, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the U.S. embargo on Cuba in the 1960s, alongside involvement in military coups and dictatorships across Latin America and Africa, were key points of contention between the Americans and Soviets. The desire for one bloc to surpass the other and strengthen their nations fueled the Cold War. This manifested in various arenas. Culturally, through visual arts, literature, and especially cinema, in espionage, with the polarized rivalry between the CIA and the Soviet KGB, and even in sports, reflected in Olympic medal rankings. For example, the United States dominated the Olympics in 1948, 1952, 1968, and 1984, while the Soviets led the medal count in 1956, 1960, 1964, 1972, 1976, 1980, and 1988. The space race also propelled Cold War tensions. The Soviets sent the dog Laika as the first living being to orbit Earth in 1957, while the United States achieved the monumental feat of landing men on the Moon in 1969. Nevertheless, no aspect of this conflict was more symbolic than the nuclear arms race. Between the 1940s and 1960s, the tension between the two nations peaked as both prepared for a potential nuclear conflict, heavily investing in scientific research and stockpiling highly potent nuclear warheads. However, both sides understood the catastrophic consequences of using such weapons, which could literally destroy humanity. Over the years, tensions eased, but they flared up again in 1977 when diplomatic relations deteriorated, and for the first time, the Soviet nuclear arsenal was reported to have surpassed that of the U.S. The late 1970s and the 1980s became another period of heightened conflict between the superpowers. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, where they maintained influence for a decade, became the last military conflict between the two blocs. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union faced increasing economic and political instability, gradually losing influence to the capitalist bloc. Many historians mark the end of the Cold War on November 9, 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. This event symbolically broke down the barriers between the two blocs in Germany, allowing families to reunite after many years. Capitalist ideals of freedom triumphed over socialist promises of equality. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, marking the definitive end of the greatest ideological war in human history, which spanned 44 years. Socialist regimes became limited to a few nations, notably China, Vietnam, Cuba, and North Korea. Meanwhile, most countries adopted democratic republics or monarchies aligned with capitalist ideals. And so ended the Cold War, a conflict that had the potential to become the Third World War, but for various reasons, and fortunately for humanity, never escalated into a global nuclear conflict.